good morning to our participants for joining with us today. It gives me immense pleasure to welcome you all to the seventh volume of Crime, Justice and Society Dialogues organized by the Indian Society of Criminology. I thank each one of you, students, scholars, practitioners, and faculty members from across institutions and regions for being part of this session. Before we proceed, I would like to briefly introduce the society and this lecture series, particularly for participants who are joining us for the first time. The Indian Society of Criminology was established in 1970 at the Department of Criminology, University of Madras, with the objective of advancing the study and application of criminology and allied sciences. Over the past 55 years, it has grown into a national professional body with more than 2,200 members from the academia, law enforcement, corrections, law, and allied disciplines in India and abroad. The society has organized 45 All India Criminology conferences, publishes the Indian Journal of Criminology, and has consistently contributed to strengthening criminological scholarship and professional engagement in the country. The Crime, Justice and Society Dialogue lecture series has been conceived as a bi-weekly academic platform to bring together scholars from India and across the world. The aim is to create an accessible space for meaningful engagement with criminological theory, research, and comparative perspectives and contemporary issues, especially for students and early career scholars. I would also like to place on record our sincere gratitude to the leadership of Indian Society of Criminology for their constant encouragement and support for this initiative, particularly Dr. N.K. Chakrabarti, President IAC, Dr. Madhav Somasundaram, Chairperson IAC, and Dr. M.D. Alan Selvakumar, Secretary IAC, and all other office bearers of the society whose guidance and trust have made this lecture series possible. I sincerely thank our speaker, Ms. Dhanya Babu, for accepting our request to be part of this series. Ms. Dhanya Babu is an adjunct lecturer in the International Criminal Justice Program at CUNY John Jay College of Criminal Justice and a doctoral candidate in the Department of Criminal Justice at John Jay. She holds 2 master's degrees, an MA in International Crime and Justice from John Jay College, City University of New York, and an MA in Criminology and Criminal Justice Administration from the University of Madras, India. Additionally, she has a postgraduate diploma in victimology and victim assistance from TIVI Mito, Japan. Before relocating to the United States, Ms. Dhanya worked as a human trafficking investigator for the International Justice Mission in India, where she played a critical role in rescuing victims of human trafficking. Ms. Dhanya's research focuses on broadening the understanding of gender-based violence by incorporating the perspectives of LGBTQ plus communities, particularly through the lived experience of Tirunangai trans women community in Chennai, in India. Her work challenges traditional criminological frameworks by examining violence through an intersectional, gendered, and decolonial lens, emphasizing the structural inequalities that shape marginalized communities' experiences with crime and justice. She strongly advocates for an inclusive criminological approach to addressing harm and justice, ensuring the representation of diverse identities and lived realities in crime studies. With that, I once again thank you all for joining with us today. I also kindly request all participants to mark their attendance by filling out the Google form shared in the chat box to facilitate the issuance of certificates. I now invite Ms. Dhanya Babu to take the session forward. Over to you, Ms. Dhanya. Thank
Thank you, Santosh, for that very warm welcome and very detailed introduction. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Indian Society of Criminology, for having me here today. So, without further ado, let's move forward to the presentation. In this talk, I'll be drawing on some of my early findings from my doctoral research with Tirunangais, Santosh mentioned before, a trans feminine community in Tamil Nadu. Some of you might be familiar with them. So, the goal of my presentation is to make you think that the LGBTQ plus experiences need a lot more attention in criminological scholarship in India. More specifically, I want to argue that while criminology has done important work on gender based violence, much of it is still relying on a binary understanding of gender. That also operates in many socio legal institutional settings. And because of that, the experiences of trans and gender non conforming, gender diverse communities often stay at the margins, both when it comes to research and in policy making. And unless we address how gender operates in institutional settings, we cannot effectively address gender based violence. So, to start, I'd like to share a quick personal story, one that is one that has shaped how I first started thinking about gender. Back in 2008, when I was an undergrad student, I attended the National Cadet Corps Republic Day Selection Camp in Kerala, NCC Republic Day Selection Camp in Kerala. So I had a very short hair at that time. It was a style that I loved because it made me feel comfortable and confident, but it was very short. So one afternoon, I was standing in the lunch line for women in the NCC uniform. If you know, it's like khaki, like police officers. And that is when I felt a sharp thud on my back. It was a senior cadet who was in charge of discipline, and he had hit me in the back. And he demanded to know who had given me the permission to stand in the women's line. He assumed that I was a boy. And I was stunned, and tears started rolling down my cheek. And he saw that, and he realized his mistake. He mumbled an apology, and he walked off. And a few weeks later, I'm on a bus home, sitting in a seat reserved for women in Kerala buses. And a woman got in, and she looks at me and she said, "Son, can you move? This seat is for women." It was only when I smiled a bit awkwardly that she realized that, no, I was actually supposed to be sitting there. At that time, these were like very embarrassing stories that I'd laugh about. But over the years, they started to mean something more. I found myself wondering, why was my short hair enough for people to read me as a boy? But the moment I smiled or the moment I cried, I was read as a woman. Why do certain appearances just signal man or woman to people instantly, right? And that's really when it hit me. Gender isn't really who we understand ourselves to be. It's also how we are read, how we are interpreted, and also how we are regulated by others. So these experiences, I would say, took a completely different meaning in 2013. It was when I first started working with the Tirunangais, thanks to University of Madras. During my master's in criminology, I started working with Tirunangais and also started my master's thesis on Tirunangai experiences. And what struck me was this the same gender norms that occasionally caused me a moment of discomfort showed up in their lives in much more intense form. Uh, what had been a brief, awkward misunderstanding for me was for them something far more persistent. As social policing, exclusion, discrimination, violence were all not occasional for them, but was an ongoing experience. And that really pushed me to think more carefully about the relationship between gender and violence. We talk about gender based violence all the time, and we have so many researchers on it. But what is actually gendered about these violence? We always ask the question, who perpetrate harm on whom, but we never really question what is actually gendered about these violent experiences. So those questions eventually became the foundation of my dissertation, where I look at how Tirunangais experience and understand gender and how it operates across the three dimensions of their lives: individual, interactional, and institutional. And how that in turn shapes violence in their lives. And now, a lot of scholarship on gender based violence, like I mentioned, has focused, understandably, on documenting violence against cisgender women. And that work has been very important, absolutely necessary. But the thing is, gender in the scholarship is often understood through a binary lens. So, gender based violence ends up becoming almost synonymous with violence against cisgender women. And it's almost synonymous with violence perpetrated by cis men on cis women. And what falls out of that picture is the LGBTQ plus experiences. These remain largely absent from criminological scholarship in India. So I'd argue that these absence matters. It kind of limits how we understand gender and it limits how we understand violence. So queer criminology, which is by now very well established in many countries in criminological scholarship, it kind of offers us a way to open up that conversation. It helps us to ask how systems of gender and gender regulation themselves shapes experiences of victimization, exclusion, and justice. So today I want to focus specifically on institutional dimension of gendered violence. So drawing on my research with Tirnangais, I'll walk you through how gender operates through institutions and how that influences violence in their lives. And what I found ultimately was that unless we address the gendered culture and practices at the grassroots level, grassroots institutional level, we cannot effectively tackle gender based violence. Um, so, to understand the experiences of Tirunangais, I move beyond traditional views that treat gender as a fixed and binary category, drawing from social constructionist perspectives. Scholars such as Simone de Beauvoir reminds us that gender is not something that we are born with, but something that is produced through social processes. Judith Butler, another well known gender theorist, and other queer theorists have further argued that gender is not fixed, but it is continually enacted and negotiated in everyday life. At the same time, there are intersectional scholars such as Kimberly Crenshaw, who showed us that doesn't always operate alone. It intersects with other social locations and systems of power like caste, like race, class, ability, and age, shaping how people experience privilege, marginalization, and violence. So while these perspective helps us understand the fluidity and complexity of gender, my study particularly is informed by the work of Cornell and Risman, who conceptualized gender as a social structure, like you can see in the figure on the slide. So, from their perspective, gender operates not only at the level of identity, not only at individual level, which is mostly most researchers have focused on, but also through interactions and institutions, which shapes access to resources, access to recognition, power, and protection. So, it decides who gets protected and who gets neglected. So, this framework is especially useful because it allows us to examine how violence is produced not only through individual actions, but also through broader social and institutional arrangements. So, it therefore provides a useful lens for understanding the lived experiences of their Nangais. So before I move forward, I'll give like a brief context about the study. Um, um, I'd like to provide some brief background on Tirunangai community and the policy context that shapes their lives, particularly in Tamil Nadu. So, transgender communities in India have had a long history, and many of you might already know that. They use different regional terms to identify themselves, including Hijras, Kinnars, Aravanis, Joktas, and many others. So, these communities have been part of the social, cultural, and religious fabric of South Asia for centuries. And this study focuses on Tirunangais, like I mentioned, a trans feminine community specific to Tamil Nadu. So the term Tirunangai means respectable woman, with Tiru serving as an honorary prefix and Nangai means woman. So for many, the term kind of reflects both gender identity and a claim to dignity and social recognition. Historically, Tirunangais have been embedded in community-based kinship networks, meaning they live together with other Tirunangais, like a family, families of choice. They have their own ritual practices, they have their own forms of labor, and many have participated in what we call a ceremonial blessing tradition known as badai, as well as ritualized begging. And for some, sex work is a means of economic survival. So these communities have long maintained their own systems of care, belonging, and support. But however, their social position drastically changed under the British colonial rule. I'm not saying that they were celebrated before the British colonial rule, but in some way, obviously, there were patriarchal and caste based oppression that these communities experienced prior to British colonial rule. But under the British colonial rule, their social position changed significantly. While gender diverse communities had a long existing identity within the subcontinent, colonial policies increasingly stigmatized and criminalized them institutionally. So, the Criminal Tribes Act of 1871, many of you might have heard about it, classified the so called eunuchs as inherently suspicious and criminal, along with other marginalized castes. And this contributed to the surveillance and marginalization of transgender communities across India. So, similarly, Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code criminalized queer sexual relationships over a century. Although it was struck down in 2018, its social legacy kind of continues to shape the attitudes towards gender and sexual diverse communities even today. So, against this historical backdrop, Tamil Nadu emerged as pioneers in gender welfare and social justice initiatives. The state is often recognized for adopting some of the most progressive policies for transgender communities in India. A major milestone was the establishment of Transgender Welfare Board in 2008. It is first of its kind in India and globally, arguably. And the board coordinated a range of welfare initiatives, including support for healthcare, education, employment, housing, scholarship, gender affirming medical care for transgender communities in the state. And there were additional programs that included transit and shelter homes, access to ration cards, access to identity documents. There was support for self help groups and small businesses. There was also a monthly pension for eligible transgender individuals over the age of 40. And even more recently, the state introduced the Tirunangaigal app, mobile application, to make welfare services easier to access. And in 2025, just last year, while I was doing this data collection, Tamil Nadu further expanded these efforts through what they called the Tamil Nadu Transgender Policy, which aimed to strengthen inclusion across healthcare, education, employment, housing, and social protection. Even though there were a lot of pushback from the community, there were like certain initiatives by the Tamil Nadu government to include trans women, to help trans women access these facilities. So these initiatives have made Tamil Nadu an important model for transgender welfare in India. However, as the findings of my study will demonstrate to you, the legal recognition and policy protections do not always translate into meaningful lived reality. It doesn't always translate into meaningful inclusion in everyday life because of how gender operates in these institutions, which I will discuss later. Um, so before that, let's see the Indian legal context and the reforms that are there presently in India. So when we look at the legal reforms in India, the recognition of transgender identities have evolved significantly over the past decade, though not without contradictions. A major turning point came in 2014 with the landmark NASA versus Union of India judgment. So, in this decision, the Supreme Court recognized gender identity as a fundamental aspect of person's dignity, autonomy, and freedom. The court ruled that individuals should not be required to undergo medical procedures such as surgery or hormone therapy to have their gender identity legally recognized. Instead, the code affirmed that the principle of self identification should be recognized. It stated that a person's self perceived gender should take precedence over biological definitions of sex. So it clearly differentiated sex and gender. And the code also directed the governments to recognize transgender persons as a distinct gender category and take steps to prevent discrimination. So this was followed by three other important judgments. There was also in 2017 the Puttasamy case, which recognized privacy as fundamental right, and that affirmed the right to bodily autonomy and personal identity. Then in 2018, the Navtej Singh Johar judgment decriminalized consensual same-sex relationship by striking down the infamous Section 377 of Indian Penal Code, which marked an important step toward recognizing sexual diversity in India, sexual and gender diversity in India. And building on these developments, the government passed the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Act in 2019. It was India's first comprehensive legislation that focused on transgender rights. So, this law was the result of years of advocacy and activism by the transgender communities and their allies. It was imperfect, it was not perfect, it was far from it, but it represented an important step forward for prohibiting discrimination in education, employment, healthcare, public services, and by recognizing the constitutional right to self perceived gender identity, it served as one of the important legal reforms for the protection of transgender persons in India. However, recently there was initiatives to amend the Transgender Protection of Rights Act, um, which highlighted the tension surrounding transgender rights in India. The amended language adopts a much narrower definition of transgender identity. It focused primarily on certain sociocultural identities such as hijras, kinnars, jogtas, Aravanis, and also used colonial terms like eunuchs. And it also recognized certain intersex variations. So the critics of these amendments argue that this approach excluded many people, including Tirunangais and genderqueer individuals, trans masculine people, and several community specific identities. So the amendments also include language suggesting that a transgender identity could be assumed through force, through inducement, influence, and medical intervention. So, this framing has raised a lot of concerns because it implies that transgender identities can be imposed on individuals rather than recognized as an authentic aspect of selfhood. Some advocates also worry that these provisions could create barriers for gender affirming care. And so, overall, India's legal landscape presents a very complex picture for trans communities. On one hand, court judgments have increasingly affirmed dignity, autonomy, and self identification. On the other, there are newer legislative developments that reveal continuing debates over who is recognized, protected, and included. So these tensions between legal recognition and lived realities form an important backdrop for understanding the experiences of Tirunangais discussed in this study. So these backdrop and legal reforms are important to know when we are discussing the findings of my study. So the participants, so this study that I conducted uses a qualitative ethnographic approach to examine how gender shapes experiences of violence in the lives of Tirunangais in Chennai. My fieldwork was conducted last year over an 8-month period from January to August 2025. Data collection consisted of 50 in depth interviews with Tirunangais and 12 interviews with activists working closely with the community. Interviews were conducted face to face in Tamil and ranged from approximately 20 to 90 minutes. In addition, I completed 118 hours of participant observation to better understand the participants' everyday experiences and social interactions. Um, this was a community engaged research, meaning many of the questionnaire, the community involvement is all through this research. Participants were recruited primarily through snowball sampling. Participants represented diverse backgrounds in terms of age, education, place of birth, occupation, including individuals engaged in sex work, community based organizations. There were Badai practices, there were people who were owning small businesses, people engaged in religious work, and also artists. Finally, this research was made possible through the collaboration with several community based organizations in Chennai, including Sahodran, Tori, Sati, Nirangal, Kwe Casting, and Orinam. So the interview and observation data were analyzed using thematic coding to identify key higher order themes and sub-themes that emerged across the participant experiences. So I now turn to the findings of the study. While participants described violence in many aspects of their lives, five social legal institutions consistently emerged as key sites where gender operates and shapes experiences of violence. Those were family, education, work, residential association, and the police. So, what became clear across the interviews was that violence was not experienced as isolated incidents. Rather, gender functioned as an organizing principle that structured interactions across institutions throughout their life course. Violence often began in childhood, followed participants into schools, workplaces, neighborhoods, and encounters with the criminal justice system. So let's start with family. The family was often the first site where participants encountered violence. Many described experiences of severe rejection, expressing their femininity or disclosing their gender identity. Participants spoke about being beaten, verbally abused, locked inside homes, having their hair forcibly cut, being subjected to attempts to correct their gender expression. And for many, home became a place of surveillance and punishment rather than safety. So, as a result, some were forced out of their homes, others were left voluntarily in search of safety and acceptance. One participant explained, my parents didn't know about gender identity much. Like people in my village, they also thought that I am abnormal and have a mental disease. They couldn't accept that I can completely change to a woman. They couldn't accept me at all. And they took me to mental hospital to correct me. I had to stay there for 2 days. Um, the doctor sexually abused me and I ran out of that place. Then they said a spirit possessed me. They took me to a priest and did some rituals. After I passed my 12th standard, I got admission in a college in Chennai, but they denied paying fees for me if I continued behaving like a woman. They also locked me in a room for around 4 to 5 months. So, this narrative kind of illustrates how gender nonconformity was frequently treated as illness or deviance or some kind of moral failure. Um, Families often mobilized medical, religious, and disciplinary interventions in attempts to enforce normative gender expectations. Um, then comes school and educational institutions. So the second institution where participants experienced violence was education. Many participants reported that long before they openly identified as transgender, earlier signs of femininity made them targets of bullying and harassment. Participants described being mocked by classmates, touched inappropriately, physically assaulted, and excluded from peer groups and friendships. Something as routine as using a restroom became a source of fear and anxiety for the participants. Several participants described avoiding school bathrooms altogether because of the risk of harassment and assault. Importantly, um, discrimination was not limited to the peers, but also to teachers and school staff. They reinforced gender norms by publicly shaming students, informing the parents about their behavior, or encouraging the corrective measures to bring them back to being cisgender. One participant recalled, the reason that I discontinued my studies in seventh grade was because I couldn't bear the harassment by other students in my class. They would tease me, touch me inappropriately. Even though I was studious, I couldn't continue my studies. The teacher took me to my home and told them that because he is doing things like girls do, students are making fun of him. The teacher asked my parents to advise me not to do girly things. I got a lot of beatings from my dad and brother that day. So these experiences often had long term consequences. Many participants discontinued their education, and others struggled to complete schooling because of the persistent hostility they experienced from educational institutions. Even at the college level, some reported being denied admission or pressured to leave due to harassment. As a result, educational exclusion became an important pathway through which later economic vulnerabilities were also produced for Tirnangais. Um, if we look at the third institution, which is work, due to, as I said, due to educational exclusion and discrimination in formal employment, um, many participants relied on informal forms of labor, including ritualistic blessings and begging, sex work, community-based advocacy. However, participants' experiences also revealed that exclusion from formal employment was not simply a matter of qualification. Even many who entered formal workplaces encountered harassment. They also encountered unequal treatment, discrimination based on their gender identity. One participant described her experience working in a corporate setting. I used to work at a company before I started engaging in begging and sex work, but I don't want to reveal its name. When I joined, I told them that I am a trans woman. They asked me to give orientation to my coworkers about my identity. I explained that I am a trans woman who has undergone top and bottom surgery, which bathroom I'd be using, and gave a lesson on gender identity and what it means to be me. Initially, HR informed me that I had to use the men's bathroom. I explained why should I use the men's bathroom? I'm a trans woman, I have had surgery, and I dress like a woman. I cannot do that. So he gave me a week to decide if I wanted to continue working there. I told him that I could not compromise my dignity by using men's bathroom. He then said I should email the Delhi office saying I didn't want to work there. I refused, saying that I was ready to work, but they were forcing me into an impossible situation. After escalating the issue to higher authorities and advocating for my rights, they finally allowed me to use women's toilet. But after 2 months, excuse After escalating the issue to higher authorities and advocating for my rights, they finally allowed me to use women's toilet. But after 2 months, the HR began sexually harassing me. He touched me inappropriately and tried to pressure me, asking why I wouldn't cooperate like other women do. I told him I didn't like it and eventually I resigned from my job. So, this account demonstrates how inclusion often remained conditional. Even when participants gained access to employment, they continued to face challenges to their dignity, safety, and bodily autonomy. At the same time, participants who engaged in informal work like sex work and begging also described routine experiences of extortion, sexual violence, and physical assault. Um, then comes the residential association. So, housing emerged as another significant site of exclusion. Participants frequently described difficulties finding rental accommodation despite possessing the financial means to pay. Even when they held legal land rights, local residents and neighborhood associations often obstructed housing access. They would put in unreasonable rules for them to stay in their residential areas. Many reported being pushed into marginalized areas with poor sanitation, limited infrastructure, and fewer services. One participant explained, "It is very difficult to get a house here. Only a few people are willing to rent it to us. But that too with higher rent. They will be like, if you can pay us this much, you will get it. Otherwise, you can see other houses. Everything is double the price. If water bill is 300 rupees, we have to give 500 or 700 rupees. Electricity bill, if it is 500 on the meter, I have to give 1000 rupees. They will tell if you want to take it, or find another place. It is difficult for us to find another place, so we will stay there paying higher price." So housing discrimination therefore operated not only through exclusion but also through these economic exploitation. Participants were routinely charged inflated rents, excessive utility fees, and subjected to restrictions that would not be imposed on other residents. And then comes the criminal justice system. So finally, the participants identified the police as one of the most significant sources of institutional violence. Despite progressive policies and legal protections, interactions with the law enforcement were frequently characterized by discrimination, harassment, and abuse. Participants described verbal abuse, mockery of their gender identity, arbitrary detention, extortion, and sexual exploitation. Many of the participants felt that the police viewed them not as a citizen who is deserving protection, but as inherently suspicious individuals. One participant stated, "When I am on streets for sex work, I can see from the police's looks that they hate us. They don't like Tirunangais at all. They think we are abnormal. It is fixed in their minds. And some will start beating us as soon as they see us standing on the street. But if we are being beaten by rowdies, no one will help. There are some police officers who speak to us nicely, but they often force us to have sex with them for free." Another participant explained, "Even now, rowdies take our money and force us to have unprotected sex for free. The police don't help at all. They watch us being dragged or beaten and walk by as if nothing is happening. If we complain, they ask, 'Why are you standing on the streets?' Sometimes the police extort money from our customers. Next time, those customers won't come to us because the police have told them it was us who reported them. But we rely on these customers for our daily bread." So these accounts reveal a very profound gap between formal legal protection that exists, like I mentioned before, um, but then the everyday access to justice and lived realities for the Tirunangais is very different. Um, so I would like to argue um, about this important contradiction. On paper, India, particularly Tamil Nadu, has made significant progress through legal recognition and welfare initiatives, which is very important. Um, Landmark developments such as NASA judgment in 2014, Transgender Protection of Rights Act 2019, all affirm the rights and dignity of transgender individuals. However, the participants' experiences, lived realities demonstrate that legal recognition alone does not automatically translate into safety, inclusion, or justice. So, despite progressive laws, everyday realities continue to be shaped deeply by institutionalized gender hierarchies. It continues to be shaped by how gender operates in these institutional settings at the grassroots level. Participants encountered violence not in one isolated setting, like I mentioned, but across families, schools, workplaces, neighborhood, and even with the interaction with police. So these findings support the idea proposed by Cornell and Risman, like I mentioned before, that gender operates as a social structure, one that is embedded within institutions and everyday practices. So these institutions often reinforce cis-normative expectations about how people should look, how they should behave, and how they should live, kind of reproducing the violence even in contexts where formal protections exist. Um, like I mentioned before. So the findings also suggest that the recognition is often conditional. Acceptance frequently depends on performing a particular form of respectable trans femininity that aligns with the state, cultural, or societal expectations. Those who fall outside these norms may remain excluded despite possessing legal rights. So, for criminology, these findings highlight why we need stronger engagement with queer criminology in India. Mainstream criminological research, like I mentioned, has traditionally focused on crime victimization and justice largely through cisgender heterosexual frameworks. It often overlooked how gender and sexuality shape experiences of violence. So, as a result, the everyday harms experienced by transgender or gender diverse communities kind of frequently remain invisible within criminological scholarship. So, a queer criminological perspective will allow us to move beyond individual incidents and examine how institutions themselves produce vulnerability, exclusion, and unequal access to justice. It will help us understand why violence persists even when legal protection exists, and why formal equality does not necessarily result in lived reality or lived equality. Ultimately, my study argues that if criminology in India is committed to understanding violence and justice, it must take queer lives seriously, not as a marginal topic that is added on to gender based violence research, but as central to understanding how gender operates, how power, inequality, and social control operate in contemporary society. Um, so, for that, um, we must address gendered institutional practices. We should create genuine inclusion that also requires building institutional culture that go beyond access and focus on safety, dignity, and belonging. Um, uh, where state institutions themselves become sources of harm, we should create transformative and community based approaches to justice. Um, and we should ensure that enforcement of existing protections exist. Um, we should center LGBTQ voices in policy making. Policies are most effective when they are shaped by the people that they are intended to serve. Therefore, LGBTQ plus voices must be centered in policy making. So that the rights guaranteed on paper translate into meaningful protections in practice. Finally, I argue the importance of expanding queer scholarship globally by centering non-Western experiences, such as those of Tirunangais in Tamil Nadu. We can challenge six heteronormative assumptions in criminology. We can decolonize criminology and develop more inclusive understanding of violence, justice, and social change. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions and discussion.
So thank you very much, Ms. Danya, for that extremely thought-provoking lecture. On behalf of the Indian Society of Criminology, I sincerely thank you for sharing your time, scholarship, and valuable perspectives with us today. So we will now open the floor for a brief interaction. If there are any questions or reflections from participants, you may kindly raise them or post your questions in the chat box. We'll try to take in as many questions as time permits.
I see that there are a few questions on the chat already. Should we start answering that?
Yes, ma'am. Sure, ma'am.
Okay. Um, the first question is from Dr. Shankar Verma. From your experience conducting research on LGBTQ plus issues, how receptive is the community to criminological research? What are the major challenges in building trust, encouraging participation among LGBTQ plus individuals in India? Um, this is a very good question because LGBTQ plus communities are eh, in some way over researched, especially by the medical sector, sociology, and anthropology. And at one point, I think they have started feeling like this is an extractive process where researchers go in, extract data from them for their own publication, for their own books and journals, but nothing really happens to them, right? Like nothing benefits them from these research. It's just that the data is being collected from them, and it almost feel exploitative, and it's only natural for them to kind of feel hostile to researchers. Um, so I was particularly um, aware of this exploitative nature of research. So I wanted to make sure that my research is more community engaged and intersectional. So what I did was I contacted some of the NGOs in India, in Chennai, and before I started preparing my questionnaire, I went in and started working with these organizations to know what actually are their needs, what are they expecting from a research, and that is how I started my research. And then I also was aware that the time that they spent with us is the time that they would be engaging in informal work, and then they would be losing that day's probably some money that they would be otherwise earning. So I was um, kind of um, aware of it and address those issues as well. So I went in through the NGOs and the community leaders to know, to ensure that the research is not extractive and exploitative in nature, and started building trust. I got involved in many of the programs that were arranged by these NGOs, was a volunteer at the Pride March in Chennai. And throughout the research process, there was community engagement, and that is how um, um, I think I encouraged participation from the LGBTQ plus individuals as such. But they were all very, once they get to know us, and if our intention is not exploitative, they are very supportive and friendly. So that helped me a lot. And I hope I answered the question. Now, second question is from Alice D'Souza. Thank you for the insightful presentation based on your experience as both a researcher and education. How do you envision the development of queer criminology in India over the next decade? What do you think are the most critical gap gaps that young researchers like us should prioritize. Um, I think having so one thing that I feel about conducting research based on LGBTQ plus experiences is that it shouldn't be like an add-on to existing criminological research, right? It should come as like it should be centered on existing research. What I mean by that is, for example, in gender-based violence, LGBTQ experiences come as like an add-on to like a section that you would add on to gender-based violence. It's not really that. It should be centered on gender-based violence. These are communities who are experiencing the extreme forms of gender enforcement. We should start rethinking, and we should move away from boxing communities to centering um, the core issues that they face. Like the experiences should be the focus rather than considering them as just an attribute to be added on to existing research. So that I think that is one important factor when researching LGBTQ plus experiences. And also, I think it should be community engaged. We all come into research with our own assumptions and baggages and ideas about what these communities are. But we would all be wrong. For example, when I first conducted research in 2013, I was very much focused on the violent experiences and the types of violence that they experience. So at that time, I was particular about, are they facing physical violence, verbal violence, psychological violence? I wanted to tick those boxes, right? And how many of them have experienced those? And how many Tirunangais have experienced sexual abuse? So I wanted to check boxes. But I think it's time that we move beyond that, and especially when researching on communities who are uh, under researched, we should make sure that our research is community engaged. Their problems should emerge from them. We should involve them in our research, and that's only how we'd be able to make meaningful research findings. Um, this time when I went, I was also thinking that okay, I'll not check boxes this time, but I'm sure there will be some kind of police violence, there would be sexual assault and all that, and that might be more extreme forms of violence that they face, and there would be gendered ways in which they experience. Even though I didn't want to, I had those assumptions in my mind. But it's only when I started talking to them that I got to know that, um, of course, there are extreme forms of violence, but then there are certain kinds of violence that they feel mostly affected by. And it's not, you would be surprised that participants talk to me about having their hands and necks slit by rowdies when engaging in sex work, but that did not break them. What broke them was like when they were entering into a romantic relationship with a cis man, and that cis man extorted money from them and cheated them and went. And that is one of most of the participants that I engaged with also talked about these relationship issues that kind of affected many Tirunangais. And it is like one of the highest reasons for Tinangai suicides in Tamil Nadu. So, our research should be community engaged. It would be different from what we are assuming. I think it's best if we are thinking of including LGBTQ experiences in our research, we center their voices. Um, I'm not sure if I'm answering any of your questions rightly, but those are my few cents. From your research, do you think the greatest challenge for LGBTQ individuals lies in victimization itself or in their interactions with criminal justice institutions such as um, the police, courts, and prisons? Um, that's a good question. Like I mentioned before, I wanted to rank, even though I felt like I shouldn't. I always, as criminologists, we always want to rank and generalize and find the statistics out of all these, right? But talking to them, I felt like we cannot really rank the gendered violence experiences that these community members experience, because um, these gender-based violence kind of is additive, meaning it accumulates over time. So even if one person has not experienced sexual assault, it kind of piles up on family violence, sexual harassment, or police brutality, discrimination, housing association rejections. So these kind of pile up. So we cannot really rank what would be the most challenging or extreme greatest challenge, right? It's not kind of episodic, but it is cumulative, if it makes sense to you. Um, we I realized that I cannot box these experiences. These experiences start from the families, then goes to school, then goes to workplace, and it kinds of adds up. So when they are experiencing violence from the criminal justice system, they are also reminded of their prior experiences, and how they react and respond are based on their uh, whole experience in throughout their life course, right? So that's what I feel, from that is what has emerged from my research. um, Thanks to the ISCN speak for this wonderful theme. Thank you. Do you think criminology curriculum in Indian universities, colleges adequately address LGBTQ plus issues, or is there a need for dedicated courses, training to prepare future researchers and practitioners? Of course, when I was doing my master's in India, I don't know much about the curriculum in the master's classes now. But I think everywhere, not just in India, but everywhere, I think it is important to address LGBTQ plus issues. It's important to rethink gender as a whole, right? It's not just LGBTQ plus issues, like I mentioned before. Gender as an issue has to be addressed in um, almost all criminological curriculums. We should start reconsidering and relearning gender from the binary understanding to gender as a structure. So when we start understanding gender as a structure and as something that is ongoing, that operates in different levels, it would not only address the experiences of LGBTQ plus community, but also will help us understand other gender issues experienced by everyone, including cis men, including cis women, and other gender diverse communities. So I think it is important to adequately address gender and rethink it from binary to as a structure that operates in different levels throughout our life course. Um, all right. Um, do we have, do we still have time, or there are, I see that there are some more questions.
Ma'am, yes, ma'am. We have time, but you can answer if you want, ma'am, or we can close the class session.
All right. I think I have like 2 more minutes and then um, okay. Okay, somebody has asked me, should same-sex marriage be criminalized? No, it should be legalized. If you were advising young criminology researchers in India, what are the most underexplored? If you were advising young criminology researchers in India, what are the most underexplored areas in LGBTQ plus and criminal justice research that is of immediate scholarly attention? I think, Devashri, I think I answered some of your questions in the previous answer, I think the research should be community engaged. So when you start the research, start involving the LGBTQ plus community members and start talking to them. Then we'll understand what are the current issues that they are facing, and then you would be able to continue the research with them. Vocal. Okay, yeah. Official crime statistics in Indian crime does not capture sexual orientation or gender. Um, we even do not have a proper statistics for transgender communities in India. We don't know. Um, we do not have a data on how many people identify as. Even though it started with 2011, and that is like the last census that we have, we are still undercounting the gender diverse communities. So having crime statistics, official crime statistics in India is, I think, a far-fetched dream. But even then, I'm not sure. It kind of there is a chapter for crimes on women, but if we are addressing gender identity and sexual orientation, I don't know how that chapter should look like. I would like your inputs on that. But then I'm still again, I don't think like again boxing those experiences would help us in any ways. Um, and especially when policing, it's like the reporting of crimes against the Langas is very less, and trans communities are very less, and the relationship between criminal justice system and gender diverse communities are very um, complex. I think even if like they start a chapter on crimes against gender diverse and LGBTQ plus communities, I'm not sure if it would actually reflect accurate incidents. Like many gender-based violence incidents, which has got black figures, I think it would be more intense when it comes to crimes against gender diverse and LGBTQ plus communities. Um, Queer criminology is still an emerging field in India. In your opinion, should it evolve as a distinct subdiscipline of criminology, or should queer perspectives be integrated across all areas of criminological research and teaching? Uh, Queer criminology is an emerging field in India, but it's also now a established field, but still growing in the US and the UK and many other parts of the world. Um, it should include all the criminological research. I have like friends who are working on gang violence, where gay gang communities are involved. It should include all the criminological research areas, but it should have its own subdiscipline so that more queer criminological research can be encouraged, right? I am one of those people who are benefiting from having like a subdiscipline of queer criminology in the US, so that there are panels and there is like a community as such where we can share research and data. So I think, especially when it comes to these emerging disciplines, it would be great to have a subdiscipline of its own, even though it can research on different criminological experiences. I think having a subdiscipline would be great. Um, do you find that many LGBTQ victims choose not to report crimes because they fear being judged? If so, how can we change that? That's like a 2-hour question. Definitely, as I mentioned, the police criminal justice relationship with LGBTQ communities are very challenging because right from the colonial times, there has been efforts to criminalize these communities. So over historically, these communities have been um, arbitrarily arrested, criminalized, seen as deviants. right? So when it comes to reporting crimes to the police, it is always challenging. There were stories told by my participants where even lives could have been saved if the police officers had taken the reports by these Tirunangai seriously. I've had heard stories of many respondents where they went to the police, they did not take their um, report seriously, and it resulted in Tirunangais committing suicide, and more violence occurring to other members of the community. So I think it's a very serious issue that has to be addressed. I think transformative justice is one way to address this issue, having multi-agency inclusion in addressing um, um, crimes that are underreported, where there are social service agents involved in helping their Nangayas to report crime, more involvement from other agencies and social institutions to help address issues faced by communities that have a challenging relationship with the criminal justice. So, transformative justice system could be one way to rethink criminal justice in India. Um, I think I kind of addressed all questions. Um,
Shall we wind up, ma'am?
yeah, sure.
So, as we come to the close of today's session of Crime, Justice, and Society Dialogues, I would like to formally place on record our heartfelt thanks to our speaker, Ms. Dhanya Babu, for delivering such an enriching lecture. Thank you, ma'am. I would also like to extend my sincere gratitude to the leadership and office bearers of Indian Society of Criminology for their constant encouragement and support in making this lecture series possible. My thanks also goes to all participants, students, scholars, practitioners, and faculty members whose presence and active engagement have made the session vibrant and purposeful. We look forward to your continued participation in these forthcoming dialogues, which promise to broaden perspectives and deepen critical engagement with contemporary criminological issues. I kindly request all of you to regularly visit the ISC website and follow official social media handles for announcements, registration details, and updates regarding future sessions. Once again, thank you all for being part of this meaningful beginning. We look forward to seeing you in next volume of Crime, Justice, and Society Dialogues. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you
Thank you
so
to
much.
everyone. You can just wind up and collect your certificates from your official mail you have registered for this volume.
Thank you.